At what time did the era of modern drum manufacturing begin? When does a drum set become vintage? What makes a great drum set great? And why do some drum sets become instant classics? Today we go into detail about the SONOR Designer series. A series that set a new standard in drum manufacturing and introduced features that are still unmatched to this day. On our channel, you can find a separate video on the Designer series spare parts, where we give you an overview about what parts are still available for the restoration of your kit. The link for that video is in the description below. But before we dive deep into the Designer series, let's start one step earlier. Between the 80s and 90s. The SONOR Hilite set. If you watched our channel before, you probably came across two videos on two famous SONOR drum series from the 80s, Performer and Signature. The Signature was SONOR's flagship model of the 80s. With its iconic veneers, boxy looking hardware and thick shells, it was basically what every 80s drummer dreamed of. In '88, SONOR released another series that could in retrospect be described as an important intermediate step between the 70s and 80s drums to the upcoming 90s. The Hilite series stepped away from the SONOR typical bead shells that kept getting thicker and thicker in the past and stepped into a more American direction by choosing 9-ply maple shells. The tom mounts, floor tom brackets and snare strainers were pretty much borrowed from other 80s series, but one aspect of the hardware was a complete novelty: the lugs and gaskets. Hilite was the first top-of-the-line SONOR set to introduce two block-shaped lugs, as well as special isolated rubber gaskets that didn't just sit on top of the shell's outer layer, but actually reached into the holes of the shell. What a great new concept. We will later discover more details about this as we dive into the Designer series. Well, with these details about the Hilite series in mind, SONOR introduced a drum set in 1994 that would set new standards in drum technology for the next 30+ years. The Designer series. Let's get into it and check out all the details about these beautiful drums. During the time of the preparation of this video, we got contacted by a customer who wanted a complete cleaning and restoration of his black Designer set. He had a very early model of the series that was originally owned by a SONOR endorser. We mainly used this set for the detailed shots of the Designer's mechanisms, and by watching the video, you can get an idea of the process it takes to polish and restore the drums yourself. Our research is mostly based on the Designer catalogs of 1994, 97, as well as general SONOR catalogs from 2000, 01, 02 and 05, 06 that have Designer drums in there. Also we got infos from other SONOR owners and the SONOR headquarters. However, if some information in the video is not correct or something important is missing, please write in the comment section below. So let's start with the shells. In the 1994 catalog, three types of shells were available: birch, maple light and maple heavy. As you can see, the birch and light maple shells came in different versions. Usually smaller toms had thinner shells and bigger toms and bass drums got thicker shells. The maple heavy version was available for all sizes in the same thickness. All of the Designer series used 45-degree bearing edges, like most high-end SONOR drums since the 70s. The shells were cross-laminated to reduce tension between the wood layers and add stability. On page 12 of the 94 catalog, you can see this neat graph that shows you what shell would result in what type of sound. A novelty that the Designer series introduced for the SONOR lineup was the big flexibility in choice of your shell sizes. The earlier Signature, Phonic and Phonic Plus usually had a particular height obligated with a particular diameter. In the early 90s, with a growing scene of custom drum makers and the demand of different drum sizes for different sounds and styles, SONOR let their customers choose what size they wanted. For example, you were able to order a 12-inch tom with 8-inch, 10-inch or 12-inch depth. At the end of the catalog, you can see these extreme differences in choice by the way their endorsers designed their own particular set. In '97, when a revised version of the new catalog was released, SONOR seemed to have dropped the heavy maple shells completely from their lineup. SONOR made an upgrade to the series again in the early 2000s. In the 2005 catalog, SONOR added the vintage maple shell to the lineup with a recipe of 2 layers of 3-ply maple wood and 2.1mm reinforcement rings for the toms, and 3 layers of 3-ply maple wood, plus the reinforcement rings for the snares and bass drums. These vintage shells are also available in the SQ2 series, which shows you that the designers had kind of a transitioning period around 2005 and 6 before they completely left the big SONOR stage for the SQ2 in 2007. But more on this topic later. An honorable mention in later years was the X-Ray series from 2005. SONOR put their Designer badges on them, even though the hardware varied in many ways. And the shells were made from clear acrylic. The concept of Designer stood for custom sizes and shell materials, which is why they count these sets as a part of the Designer brand. And even Thomas Lang, who I would consider the Arnold Schwarzenegger of drums, played them. A quick word on how shells were treated in general in the 90s. Back then, people were all about shell sound, resonance and sustain. The shell needs to breathe and we don't want all of this bad metal stuff muffling the sound. Also, we don't want all of these other drums directly connected to each other by tom arms and holes in the shells, because that would be bad for the shell sound. We could dive into this topic very deeply, but for time's sake, let's just take this information as a given. The 90s drum guys didn't want too many holes in their shells, period. And the shells needed to breathe and resonate freely. And the Designer series delivered like no other series did. But first, let's talk about the looks of the shells. Finishes. Let's go back to the Designers of 94 and 97 and see what finishes you were able to choose. In general, similar to the Signature series, the finishes were either lacquers or wooden veneers with stain and clear lacquer on top. No drum wraps were used on the Designer series. In the 1994 catalog, you could choose between 5 different solid colors, a green metallic color, 4 different sparkle colors, and 4 different variations of a bird's eye maple veneer that was only available for maple light shells. One was the natural one with clear lacquer, the other 3 were blue, green, and red stained, topped with a glossy clear lacquer as well. In the 97 catalog, the lineup switched to a larger focus on wood veneers with different patterns and stains. Besides black and white gloss, blue and white sparkle, they only had lacquered wood veneers in the lineup. Cherry and azure were 2 stained finishes with a more natural maple grain. The bird's eye maple family got a new black member, and the brand new African Bubinga veneer was added to the lineup. So in total, in the 97 catalog, 12 finishes were available. As the catalogs describe, Sonor used a new type of veneer that wasn't directly cut from tropical trees, but rather cut from a block that was artificially created by layering different wood veneers on top of each other. With this method, exotic-looking finishes can be made without harming endangered species of trees. At ST Drums, we offer veneers for your drums made with the same method to this day. Like for example, this beautiful rosewood-style veneer that didn't harm any real rosewood trees, but it is still made of real wood. Because the Sonor Signature series, which famously used Bubinga veneers, was built till the early 90s, we can assume that also the early Bubinga designers used this veneer on their shells. However, on later models, the veneer looks a lot like the Bubinga replica veneer that Sonor uses today on their SQ2 series. Like the process we just described, this veneer doesn't harm real Bubinga trees, but also looks a bit different compared to the original. In 2001, the lineup grew to 18 finishes, adding things like brilliant champagne and metallic marine. Also in 2001, below the finishes, the catchy slogan, "You get what you want," was added, which kind of sounds like a threat, but actually means that even more finishes were available on request. Having a look at the 2002 catalog, the lineup grew from 18 to 42 finish choices in total. They added lots of very interesting natural wood finishes, like the Scandinavian birch and walnut, as well as more out-of-the-box wood veneers like the tribal one, that showed up on different Sonor series in many different variations. In the 05-06 catalog, even more finish choices were introduced, like for example the black diamond and platinum fade finishes, adding up to a total of 45 colors. Like the catalog stated, the only limit might be your imagination. Let's have a look at the hardware. We start with the Lugs. The Designer series was available with 2 different lug types for the toms and bass drums, as well as 2 separate models exclusively for the snares. The first version was the long lug. That was relatively similar to the shape of the Hilite lugs that we introduced earlier. They just had a flat surface on top with the Sonor logo and typical stripe design on them. Because Designers came in so many different sizes, they had many different versions of these long lugs. This might be a good opportunity to briefly talk about the word tube lug. There are people out there who call any lug with 2 posts and a round floating bit in the middle tube lugs. However, we at ST Drums only call this classic shape tube lugs, with the ball-shaped ends and a really round tube in the middle. Our ST lugs are made similarly, but the design is quite different. However, the SONOR Designer lugs are actually not tube lugs in a classical sense. If you turn them around, you can see that the middle tube is not a closed tube at all, but a cast shape that is open on the bottom. Also, the inserts are a separate part and slightly movable. Tube lugs usually don't have an insert at all, because the thread is cut directly into the tube itself. The second lug was a short lug with 2 fixing screws. This lug silhouette stayed in the Sonor repertoire to this day. And basically all of the current series, except the vintage series, are based on this design. It is actually very clever, because looking from above, the shape resembles part of the Sonor logo. If you take 2 of these lugs, you get their logo basically. One could argue that the long lugs just used half the amount of holes in the shell therefore allowing the shell to resonate better. Also, an argument could be made that the shape of the long lugs would distribute the forces from the heads differently, but at the end of the day, both lugs worked fine, and it is more or less a matter of personal taste which one you prefer. Like the snap-lock system that was introduced in the 70s, the Designer Series brought its own brand new anti-detuning technology to the scene: tension rods. While the previous flagship models of Sonor used the snap-lock system with flattened tension rods, the Designer Series went back to regular, round, quarter-inch tension rods. But the lugs had a brand new feature. The tip of the lugs inserts are square-shaped. For this, special tune-safe rubber to fit on. On our customer's kit, these tune-safe rubbers were mostly broken, so we exchanged all of them. This is one of the few spare parts of the Designer Series that Sonor still sells. The hole in this rubber piece is slightly too narrow for the tension rod to go through. You have to forcefully push the tension rod in a bit, and then the thread will cut itself into the rubber material. This will ensure an extra tight fit on the tension rods and additional friction on the thread in order to minimize detuning. Talking about lugs and tight fits, all of the new Sonor hardware also came with self-cutting fixing screws, meaning that the lugs didn't have a thread in the bottom originally. The screws had very sharp threads and would cut their way into the lug the first time they were used. That way they fit very snug and didn't wobble around. Similar screws have been used in the German car industry for years. If you own a used Designer set, be warned though. If you disassemble your kit and want to put the screws back in there, be very, very gentle, because you might accidentally cut a second thread in there, ruining the inside of the lugs. Also, if you disassemble them often, they will not stay as snug. So now let's take a look at the snare lugs. This model was used on very short snare drums, like this 14 by 4.5 inch snare from our customer. I cannot say for sure, but to me it always looks like they are drilled slightly tilted. If you hold the lugs in your hand, it looks pretty straight, but I think they might be designed to be fixed to the shells slightly tilted. The tension rods on the snare were extremely long, but the inserts in these lugs are actually open on the back, so the tension rod can be screwed in there infinitely deep. Another model of lugs was available for 5 to 8 inch snares. Basically, it is just a single post with 2 inserts. Both lugs were used in later models, like for example the Hilite Series, but they also got rid of the tune-safe rubbers on the outside. These later editions of the snare lugs are still available as spare parts. But for that, make sure to check out our separate video guide on all the spare parts for the Designer Series. Another pretty interesting feature on the larger snares is that the lugs are drilled off-center. For example, on this 14 by 8 snare drum, they use 60mm tension rods on the better side and 100mm tension rods on the snare side. Probably this design was chosen because the snare side is tuned more tightly, and this way you got more thread on the bottom. However, it could also have something to do with the forces pulling on the lugs. Now, talking about the lugs, there is one detail where the Designer Series really shined. Like already mentioned, in the 80s and 90s, there was a time when almost any drum manufacturer seemed to focus on vibrations of the shell and techniques to avoid these vibrations to be interrupted. People wanted a full open drum sound, and one detail that the Designer Series brought to the table were these gaskets under their lugs. They used the same APS system known from the Hilite series, but actually upgraded the appearance of their washers on the outside of the shell as well. In the past, drum sets had just used a flat piece of rubber or vulcanized fiber under their metal parts. The Hilite series created a small bed where the lug would sit in, but now the Designer series made it look like a rubber fortress built around the metal to protect it from enemy intruders. By the way, APS stands for Advanced Projection System. We talked about the Designers having 2 tom and 2 snare lug types before, but actually now that we are looking at the bass drums, we have to mention that there was a 5th type of lug on the series. The bass drum lugs didn't have the square insert piece that would hold the tune-safe rubbers. Does that mean that the bass drums didn't have any anti-detuning features, like the Phonics series back in the 70s? No. The anti-detuning feature was actually hidden inside the bass drum claws. The tension rods had these beautiful knurled 28mm rings around them, and below the head they slid on these square rubber pieces. Once you put the tension rods in the bass drum claws, you will realize that there is a square indentation in there. The square rubber box will fit in there, and because it fits on the tension rods so tightly, it will increase the friction and therefore decreasing detuning on the tension rods. These original squares are made from the same material as the tune-safe rubbers and get sticky and break over time. However, because they are not available as a new spare part from Sonor, we decided to make them ourselves, and now they are available exclusively at stdrums.com. Now let's start at the tom-toms and work our way down to the bass drum. tom mounts. The toms of the Designer series introduced Sonor's version of tom-tom rims to their lineup. Original Gauger as well as rims from other 90s drums hooked onto the drums at the tension rods. Sonor used a pretty different approach early on. The tom mounts basically grabbed the lugs and then only connected with them by the thick rubber isolators. The whole tom mount altogether resembles the capital letter H if you tilt it sideways. It basically consists of 3 parts. One bar stretches between the top lugs. The bars are made for each drum diameter in a slightly different size. Then you have the middle bar, which came in different lengths for each tom-tom depth. And then the lower bar, which sat between the lower lugs. The upper bar is tightly connected to the middle one with screws and has the mounting part on there that is used to fix the drum to the tom arms. This is the first time in our video where we come across a very interesting design feature of the series. The knurled rubber rings. This one is around 40 mm in diameter, and if you tighten this knurled nut, the tom will be fixed to the tom arm. The 40 mm ring is available as an exclusive replica in our store at stdrums.com. On the lower half of the system, the middle bar is connected to the lower bar with a very small screw that also has a knurled ring around it with 28 mm diameter. Because this 28 mm ring is still used on the SQ2 bass drum tension rods, these rings are still available as a brand new Sonor spare part on our website. This part of the tom-tom is actually called the acoustic gate. If the small screw is loose, the tom mount just holds the tom on the upper half of the drum, and the lower half can still tilt forward and also resonate more, resulting in a very long sustain. If you tighten the screw, you basically build a bridge between the upper and lower part of the H-bar, and the whole thing becomes one single stiff piece of tom mounting equipment, shortening the sustain and giving you kind of a tighter sound. This feature is very unique and still used on high-end Sonor drum kits till this day. Because I was very curious of the acoustic gate's influence on the sound, I recorded a small demo with one tom-tom where the acoustic gate is completely opened and completely closed. Let's have a listen. Well, keep the knurled rubber rings in mind, because we will come across these more often in the video. Rocket launcher. Well, now that we talked about the toms, let's go down a level and see how the toms are connected to the bass drum. We already established that in the 1990s, contact between structural hardware and drum shells were considered evil. The Designer series delivered like no other drum kit when it comes to this concept. Previously, bass drum mounts had 4 small and 1 giant hole in the center where a tom arm could be put in. Now kids, who of you can guess how many holes the Designer series bass drum mount used? Exactly, no holes at all. Actually, it used the same concept as the H-bar tom mount. There was a giant metal plate connected to the rubbers around the 4 lugs on top of the bass drum, or 2 lugs if you got the long lug version. It just sits on there without direct contact to the shell, allowing the shell to resonate. This metal plate has kind of a high-speed train rail on top, where a huge piece of metal slides in. This part is known as the rocket launcher. You have 2 nuts with 40 mm knurled rubber rings to tilt the whole rocket launcher. One of these rings is knurled and turns, the other one is flat on the outside and doesn't turn. People see the 40 mm knurled ring in our shop and ask if we could also provide the flat one, but actually it's the same one. Just turn it inside out. Then, on top of the rocket launcher, you can slide the tom arms and memory clamps. The tom arms have a 3D ball that can be adjusted and then fixed with 1 lever. The height of the tom arm is chosen and fixed with a slotted screw. So let's recall that. You can slide back and forth, tilt the whole rocket launcher, go up and down with the tom arms individually. Then you can adjust the placement of the toms with the 3D ball. And then you can push and pull the L-shaped arm into the ball joint to get the drum closer or further away from you. Please. If anybody knows any other drum set that has that many options to adjust the toms on top of the bass drum, comment down below. No, wait, actually, we wouldn't get any comments. Let's say comment if you know a drum set that doesn't have that many options. By the way, the metal plate came in different sizes to different bass drums. Also in the 97 catalog it was stated that you could order your bass drum without any bass drum mount at all. And in the 2000s, these larger brackets with a normal hole in the middle were introduced to the Designer's lineup. Now, let's have a look at the basement of the drum set. The bass drum spurs. The bass drum spurs are one of the most unique features of the Designers. While most old-school Sonor spurs and also spurs on their sets today are folded in like this, many other brands use a technique to fold the bass drum spurs back towards the player. The Designer Series technique was actually a little closer to the last one that you saw, but with a little twist. Instead of wing screws on the bass drum spurs, you turn the whole top of the mount, again a place where the knurled rubber rings can be seen. In this case, it has 50mm diameter and the replica spare part can be bought in our webshop. And for the most unique feature, we will check out the tip of the spurs. On other Sonor spurs, you have one fixed length and you adjust the height of the bass drum by folding them in different angles or by adjusting the rubber foot. Spurs of other brands usually have an extractable tip with a spike on it that is secured in place by a square head or a wing screw. The Designer spurs can be extended with the push of a button. Push the button down and pull out the spurs tip as far as you want. The rubber bellow hides the mechanism on the inside and, as you may have already guessed, can be bought as an exclusive replica spare part at stdrums.com. Like the Signature Series, the Designer's foot also has a spike mechanism in there that can be adjusted by pulling the foot out and then twisting it. The floor tom brackets and floor tom legs. While we are already deep down like that, let's take a look at the floor tom legs. The legs are pretty thick and solid, they have a big rounded rubber foot. The floor tom brackets are something very special again. As the bass drum spurs, they also use a 50mm rubber ring, and to adjust the legs, you have to turn the whole head of the bracket instead of just one small wing screw. It's a very nice and consistent design feature throughout the whole kit. Anybody who ever pulled one of these legs out probably realized that they are a bit awkward to put back in, because the inside of the bracket will turn with the head of the bracket once the feet are pulled out. So if you want to put them back in there, you first have to find the hole again. Well, it is awkward because removing the feet is actually not necessary. Sonor had an amazing idea about the storage of the floor tom legs when the kit was moved. Just untighten the brackets and then turn the whole leg upside down with the bracket. And if you want to play again, just put them back down and retighten the brackets. What a cool feature. Now that we basically went through all of the hardware parts on the toms and bass drums, let's have a quick look at the snares of the series. In the initial 94 catalog, you could get the following snare models: 14x4 and 14x5 birch or maple light, 14x6.5 maple light, heavy and birch, and 14x8 maple light and maple heavy. In the 97 catalog, the lineup was slightly changed. As we already discussed, the heavy maple shells were dropped and instead steel snares were added. You could get a 10x5 maple light snare, a 12x5 birch snare, and then the following sizes in either maple, birch or steel: 14x4, 14x5, 14x6, 14x6.5 and 14x8. In the 2000s, more snares with the tune-safe system and the Designer strainer came on the market, but they were not labeled as part of the series. You could find, for example, Signature, Symphony and Artist series sharing parts of the Designer series, but using different shells and finishes. Strainer and Buttend. Our snare drum is a very short and very early model. The strainer is this one, with horizontal drilling holes and a trumpet-style lever. Because the strainer is just able to do on and off, it was often paired with this Buttend, which had a fine-tuning feature. Vertical drillings, but very close together. Both models were also used on older snares, but for the Designers, they received a special isolated APS gasket. Other snares with 5, 6.5 and 8-inch height used the classic phonics-style strainer in the beginning, but still had the same Buttend that our snare had. Later, a new model was introduced, which can still be found on some Sonor models till this day. For example, the phonic reissue snare now has the Designer-style strainer. Well, we forgot to mention one more detail: the hoops. The toms used 2mm steel hoops. Today, most hoops are 2.3mm, or if a manufacturer goes for a more vintage approach, they make 1.6mm. The snares had special die-cast hoops made by the German company Heller, which is a huge manufacturer of car parts in Germany. It's quite funny to see the same logo on your German drum set, as well as your German car. As you can see here, compared to regular die-cast hoops made in Asia, their snare gate is way larger. Also, the parts where the tension rods go through, that we call the ears of the hoops, are bulkier. If these hoops had to be described with one German word, it would probably be unkaputtbar. Now have fun googling that. Limited edition. In our signature video, we discussed the Jet Set as well as the Special Edition series. Well, because the Designer series was built on order to the specific configuration that the customer wanted, basically every set had the chance to be kind of unique. However, it was open for all the customers to choose from the same set of size and color options. But there was one exception. SONOR collaborated with the American drum store 5-Star to create a limited run of 25 designer drum kits with 9-ply shells on the toms, 12-ply shells on the bass drum and ebony veneer, as well as golden hardware. Also, 21-ply snare drums were available. The badges don't say designer on them, but looking at the hardware and the tune-safe rubbers, it is clear that these rare sets can be counted as a designer drum. Speaking of rare finds, the designer's hardware in the 90s was always chrome-plated. In the 05-06 catalog, you can see a picture of chrome, gold and black lugs next to each other. However, in the order form, you could only choose chrome or gold. But then, if you check the 2006 price list, they have an updated version of the order form in there, which contains black hardware as a choice as well. In our online research, we weren't able to find even one single picture of a designer kit with black hardware. Pictures of golden hardware are also very hard to find, but we did manage to come across one kit on Reverb that was sold by Bentley's drum store in California. This set used to be owned by a SONOR endorser, had golden hardware and vintage shells, even though the badges had maple light. So now, knowing this information, we might consider the possibility that the black and golden hardware and the vintage shells were just used on a very small number of sets in the very late run of the Designer Series production from 2005 to 2007. If you happen to have a kit with one of these features at home, please let us know in the comments below and maybe send us some pictures. The mentioned order form in the 05-06 catalog opened up a lot of new knowledge to us. You were able to choose your shell type, drum size and finish, which was part of the designer's concept since the beginning, but now you could be even more flexible with your hardware choices. SONOR offered to order the Lugs without tune-safe rubbers and without APS, which probably means that the early SQ2 or Hilite Lugs were used on these late designers. Also, you were able to choose the classic designer rocket launcher or a more conventional bass drum bracket, also shared with the Hilite series. Or you could go with a bass drum without any mounts on top, which became kind of the standard in the mid-2000s. The toms could be chosen with an H-bar mount, T-bar mounts, which look like this, or no mount at all. The floor toms were also available with Hilite brackets instead of these nice designer ones. Now let that sink in. There might be some SONOR sets out there with a designer badge, without tune-safe, APS, H-bar mounts, rocket launcher, nor designer floor tom mounts. Imagine buying a used designer from a low-resolution picture online, and then you receive this. Well, jokes aside, it would still be a great kit, but it is very interesting to me that the designers were that flexible, and that most of the details that I showed you are actually not a 100% telltale sign of a designer set, because you were able to order your custom kit without them. Speaking of a telltale sign, let's quickly talk about the badges. The earliest designer just had these ones glued to the shell surface. Then, probably in '97, this one with screws and a gasket was introduced. Also, the before mentioned rare kits with borrowed Hilite and SQ2 hardware choices had designer badges on them. So you can always tell a designer and an early SQ2 apart by their badges. The designer's legacy. The Designer Series was built until 2007. And the SQ2 series was introduced in 2006, which means for about 1 year, both of these product lines existed simultaneously. As we already mentioned, SONOR offered to order designer drums without tune-safe and APS rubbers at the end of their production run. The SQ2 series actually lacks both of these classic features. For the toms and bass drums, they kept a short single lug of the designer, but put the tune-safe rubbers on the inside of the lug. On the snares, they either used 2 rows of the single lugs on very deep snares, 2 single lugs next to each other on a medium-sized snare, and the piccolo lug on very short snares. Later in the run, this shorter snare version of the double lug was introduced, and it is used on many snare series of SONOR till this day. Also, the knurled rubber rings on the bass drum tension rods and the acoustic gate were kept, as well as the overall shape of the H-bar tom mount. However, the large knurled rubber grips on the floor tom and bass drum brackets, as well as the tom mounts, were scratched and replaced by a normal bracket design, with a clamping mechanism that is pretty common on most brackets in the industry. A point where the SQ2 actually beats the Designer Series is the choice of shell materials and thickness. Also, a new lineup of finishes for the inside and the outside of the shells were introduced. SQ2 drums have their own online configurator in order to show you a digital preview of the drum kit of your choice. Well, even though the SQ2 is optimized in many ways, and a worthy successor of the Designer Series, many people still love the unique features of the Designer Series, therefore making it a classic SONOR kit, which for many people introduced the modern era of SONOR drums in terms of design and features. So after we learned all of that about the Designer Series, some people might ask, why do we have to go so far into detail? Why this nerdy obsession with an object that is just there to make noise? Well, to be honest, the Designer set means something to me personally. Born in late 1990, I was 4 years old when my father started our company ST Drums. I grew up with drum parts all around our house. My dad used to rehearse with some of his bands in our garage, and I loved to hear the muffled sound of their music playing through the walls of my bedroom at night when I was already in bed. It didn't even cross my mind that this was not a normal scenario in every kid's house. My father wasn't just a fan of one brand of drums or held up one model over all the other drums, but he was interested in basically almost all the drums that he could get his hands on. He wanted to understand the sets and see how he could fix them and maybe incorporate some of the techniques in the custom drum set he built. My father was known in the area to be the guy who can fix any instrument. In our modern world, big corporations don't want you to fix stuff anymore. They want you to throw away old stuff and buy their latest product. But I'm glad to be able to work in a field where people still celebrate and care for old things. Of all these drum parts in our house, I don't have vivid memories about many parts in particular, but one part that I clearly remember since my childhood was the bass drum Spurs of the Designer series. Maybe because they looked like a lightsaber from Star Wars, but I'm not sure. But many years later, when I was already working at ST Drums, my father told me if we only knew where to get a rubber bellow that could fit the Designer series, we could sell hundreds of them. Well, a bit later, I had the chance to find a manufacturer who made a new mold for us to reproduce them, as well as the other rubber parts of the series that I previously mentioned. Well, we didn't sell hundreds of them, to be honest, but I'm glad that I could contribute to my father's dream to help people who are passionate about their drums to keep their beloved drum set alive. At the beginning, we stumbled over the question, what makes a great kit great? Well, a great drum set might probably be one that sounds great, or a set that feels good to play. But to me, it is a kit that has a connection to good memories. A drum set that means something to you. Thank you, Dad.